I wasn't looking to expose anyone. I just wanted to do my job, file my reports, and go home knowing I'd done something that mattered. Something clean. My name is Natalie Reed, and for the past 8 months, I've worked as a contract environmental engineer for Gravitas Industries, a multi-billion-dollar energy and waste management corporation operating in the American Midwest. On paper, they were model citizens, carbon offset pledges, press-friendly sustainability campaigns, glossy ESG reports sent to shareholders every quarter. But paper doesn't hold the smell of chemical runoff after it rains. My assignment was simple: monitor soil and groundwater conditions near one of Gravitas's older waste treatment sites, a quiet little facility tucked just outside of Plain Ridge, Iowa, surrounded by cornfields and silence. You wouldn't even know it was industrial if not for the chain-link fences and the occasional hum of machinery beneath the soil. At first, it was routine. Sensors, samples, standard compliance documentation. Most of the readings stayed within expected thresholds, but there was always something odd. Logs would reset overnight. Certain access panels were locked even to staff with clearance. Once, a spike in lead content disappeared from the system within 24 hours. When I brought it up casually to a site supervisor, he smiled and said, "The system must have recalibrated." Right. I kept my head down. That's what you do on contracts. You do the work. Don't ask too many questions. And maybe if you're lucky, you get hired on permanently. Benefits. Stability. But then a colleague of mine, Ethan, quiet guy, PhD in hydrology, flagged an anomaly in Zone C discharge rates. He filed a formal report. 2 weeks later, he was gone. No explanation. No email. His name erased from the team roster like he'd never been there. I started to understand the rules. You can ask how something works, but you never ask why it works that way. And that's when I made a decision. I would stop assuming the system was flawed and start asking if it was designed that way on purpose. It started with a number that didn't make sense. Zone B had shown consistently low trace metals for weeks, almost too clean. I knew the site history. This area had decades of buried industrial byproduct, and yet the levels read like bottled spring water. I double-checked the sensors, then triple-checked them. Still clean. Then I pulled archived logs from last year, hoping to find seasonal patterns. But when I tried to access data from June through September, I hit a wall. File not found. Not restricted. Not redacted. Just gone. I flagged it to our data coordinator, Mason. He glanced at his screen, tapped a few keys, and said, "Yeah, some of the old reporting files were auto-archived. It's cleaning up the system. Nothing to worry about." Except it wasn't just old files. It was always the same month summer quarters. Every year, across multiple zones. And the missing data always coincided with annual EPA check-ins. A coincidence? Maybe. But then came the air quality monitors. 3 of them went offline the same week. When I asked if replacements had been ordered, the technician on duty shrugged. "Budget cuts," he said. "They're only for show." Anyway, only for show. That phrase stuck with me. This wasn't sloppiness. It was strategy. They weren't trying to catch violations. They were designing systems that couldn't detect them in the first place. The moment I knew I'd crossed a line came in a spreadsheet. I'd finally managed to recover partial logs from a manual backup I found on a neglected server node, a legacy system no one had decommissioned. It held time-stamped sensor data for a 48-hour window 2 summers ago. In it, I saw a spike, not a small one, a massive surge in arsenic levels, peaking well above federal thresholds. The data was raw, unfiltered, and very real. But when I checked the official report submitted for that same week, the arsenic level read 0.003 ppm, perfectly compliant. The raw data said 212 ppm. They hadn't just rounded down, they'd replaced it. I took screenshots, dated the logs, stored them offline. The next morning, my site badge didn't work. I tried the side gate, then the main entrance, locked out. Inside the gate, Mason saw me and looked confused. A minute later, my phone buzzed. It was HR. "Natalie, due to a reassessment of project scope, your contract is being paused while we review team needs. Please return any company property. No warning, no explanation, no access to files." Just like Ethan, they didn't fire me. They erased me. I drove home in silence, hands tight on the wheel. I'd uncovered less than 48 hours of truth, and that was enough to make them pull the plug. So I asked myself, if 2 days of real data were that dangerous, what would 10 years reveal? They thought locking me out would end it. What they didn't know was I'd already started saving everything. I had a habit. Every Friday, I emailed anonymized summary logs to my personal inbox, just for backup. I told myself, just in case. I never included names or proprietary formulas, just raw output and anomaly flags. Now, those backups were all I had. I began cross-referencing them, side-by-side comparisons of what the field instruments recorded versus what was filed in the final quarterly reports. Discrepancies everywhere, not errors, not noise. Patterns. Every summer. Always summer. Every spike. Replaced with a flat line. Every file cleaned before audits. I started building a personal report, not just data, but a timeline. A map of every deletion, every rewritten line, every missing week. I even began noting who had access to which folders at what time. Version histories, login trails, auto-deletion schedules. I wasn't doing science anymore. I was collecting evidence. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I stopped asking whether it would help me keep my job and started wondering how many people had gotten sick from drinking water they were told was safe. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had something better: intent. I spent the next 2 weeks doing nothing but digging. I barely left my apartment. I lived off frozen meals and gas station coffee. Blinds drawn, laptop always plugged in. My apartment floor was covered in printouts, color-coded spreadsheets, flowcharts, hand-scribbled maps of pipelines and reporting chains. It started as damage control. Then it turned into a mission. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. This wasn't about a single site, or even just a decade of missing data. It was a system. I found records of Gravitas operating in 9 states, all with similar site structures, outdated sensors, seasonal anomalies, identical reporting software. The internal logics behind their environmental tracking tools were proprietary, meaning no third party could audit them directly, but the behavior was the same everywhere. I looked at the dates of missing reports and cross-referenced them with EPA inspection windows. Perfect match. Then I found the suppression model. Buried deep inside one of the old PDFs, a training manual from 2015, there was a diagram showing how temporary data suppression could be implemented during sensor drift periods. It was worded innocently enough for calibration purposes. It said, but when I followed the model numbers and firmware versions, I realized something chilling. The sensors weren't malfunctioning. They were programmed to ignore specific thresholds. Lead, arsenic, mercury. Instead of triggering alerts when they spiked, the firmware simply flatlined. The data would show everything as within tolerance, no matter how toxic the reading really was. I checked model usage history. Every site still used the same firmware. Every single one. And then came the real kicker. One of the documents, an archived email chain copied accidentally into a public shareholder release, included a footnote referencing controlled risk presentation during environmental disclosures. The language was vague, but it linked to an internal process labeled CRPV7. I had no direct access to that system, but the date and timestamp of its last modification matched exactly with the deletion window of Ethan's report. This wasn't just about hiding data. They'd built software for it, engineered to look compliant on the surface, and quietly override everything beneath. It explained so much why so many reports came out clean, why no whistleblower ever seemed to get traction, why Gravitas had a spotless public record despite operating in regions with known contamination clusters. But the worst part, it had worked. No lawsuits, no headlines, no public warnings, just quiet compliance, year after year, and all of it paid for not just in corporate bonuses or shareholder value, but in people's health. The children who drank lead-heavy water, the farmers who irrigated poisoned soil, the cancer rates no one could explain. I remember staring at my wall of data, hands shaking, not because I was scared, because I was furious. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't ignorance. It was intentional design, executed with precision, and hidden behind the illusion of transparency. I saved everything double copies, triplicate backups, air-gapped storage. I wasn't just going to leak this. I was going to prove it. The first threat wasn't loud. It was quiet. Calculated. It came in the form of a password reset email, one I hadn't requested. Then a second. Then a notification that someone had tried to log into my cloud storage account from Houston, Texas. I didn't know anyone in Houston. I hadn't left Iowa in months. I changed my passwords, enabled 2-factor authentication, disconnected my backup drives from the internet. But it didn't stop there. A few days later, I got a call from a restricted number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. A man's voice. Calm. Practiced. You're misreading the situation. Ms. Reed, Gravitas has always followed protocol. Don't confuse raw data with understanding. Some numbers aren't meant to be public. Let it go. No name, no callback. Just that I played it 3 times, then deleted it, then regretted deleting it. That night, I parked my car 3 blocks from my apartment, walked a different route home, and left my curtains closed. I barely slept. The next morning, I received a formal email from Gravitas Legal. It claimed I had violated my contract by accessing restricted legacy systems and exceeding data review permissions. They requested a meeting, in person. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Lena Wyatt, an attorney I'd heard speak at an environmental justice forum 2 years ago. She specialized in whistleblower protection and federal disclosures. I didn't know if she'd even remember me. But I took a chance. She picked up on the second ring. "Ms. Wyatt," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I have something, and I think they know I do." 24 hours later, we were sitting across from each other in a cafe 2 counties over. I showed her printouts, logs, firmware documentation. I described the suppression model, the missing quarters, the call. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned forward. "You're sitting on a systems-level environmental crime, possibly criminal conspiracy. If you release this wrong, they'll bury you." "I figured," I said. "Do you have proof they know you're looking?" I told her about the login attempts, the voicemail, the legal email. She nodded. "That's not pressure. That's warning fire. The pressure's coming." And she was right. The next 72 hours were a blur of quiet aggression. My landlord emailed to inform me that someone had requested access to my lease documents on my behalf. He assumed it was for employment verification. It wasn't. A man in a Gravitas-branded jacket knocked on my neighbor's door. Asking if I still lived there, said he was following up on some company property that may have been misplaced. My former supervisor, Mason, texted me a single line. "I don't know what you're doing, Natalie, but they're watching," then nothing else. Even my old university email account got flagged for abnormal access patterns. It felt like death by 1,000 pinpricks, not enough to call the cops, but more than enough to make me question whether my next step would be safe. I met Lena again, this time. We sat in her car in an underground parking garage. She brought 2 burner phones, one for her, one for me. "From now on, you use this only," she said. "No more Gmail, no more texting. You encrypt everything. You assume every file you upload gets duplicated. You assume every search is seen." I stared at the phone. It was a flip model. No apps, just call, text, and a signal-jamming SIM. I nodded. "We're not just documenting this anymore," Lena said. "We're going to blow it open, but that means you need to be ready for real fallout." "What does that look like?" She looked me in the eye. "They'll try to discredit you, dig into your past, leak whatever they can find. Hell, they might plant something just to twist the story." "So what do we do?" She smiled, but it wasn't warm. "We don't fight them on their terms. We hit them where they can't erase the trail. Public accountability." We laid out the next moves that night. Step 1, finalize and encrypt the full archive of what I'd found, time-stamped, independently verified. Step 2, identify internal allies, people who were pushed out, like Ethan, or who quietly stepped aside. Step 3, secure media, not just a journalist, but someone with national reach, someone who'd done this before. Step 4, time the release around impact a government event, public hearing, or shareholder meeting where silence would be impossible. Step 5, survive the in-between. I walked out of that garage knowing one thing. This wasn't about fighting for my job anymore. It was about making sure no one else would drink poisoned water ever again just because someone decided it was cheaper to lie. There's a difference between discovering fraud and discovering a system built to produce it. Up until that point, I thought Gravitas was just a bad actor, a corporation cutting corners, suppressing data to protect profits. But the more I dug, the more I realized they weren't alone. They weren't even unique. Gravitas was a node in something much larger. It started with a name, Centrax Analytics, buried in the metadata of one of the firmware updates I'd pulled from an old environmental monitor. I almost missed it. But when I Googled the name, it wasn't listed under Gravitas. It wasn't listed at all. That's when Lena brought in Troy, a former data scientist turned freelance investigator. He'd worked on AI model compliance for financial firms before he walked away from Silicon Valley and started helping whistleblowers. Quiet, blunt, no small talk. He took one look at the firmware package and said, "This wasn't written by an internal IT department. This was outsourced, custom-built." He traced the Centrax firmware to a shell company registered in Delaware with 0 employees. No physical address, and a lawyer listed as CEO. But here's the kicker. Centrax had licenses with over a dozen corporations, not just Gravitas, to deploy environmental efficiency solutions. Their software promised to streamline sensor analysis, reduce false alerts, and optimize compliance workflows. In other words, it was sold to clients as a filter, a legal shield wrapped in tech jargon. That's when I understood the scope. This wasn't a cover-up. It was a business model. Companies like Gravitas paid Centrax to manage their reporting data. The contracts were written to maintain client-side control, meaning the firms could claim plausible deniability. We didn't alter the data. The system processed it according to industry standards. And who sets the standards? Private consultants who wrote the software in the first place. It was self-contained, self-reinforcing, and invisible to anyone outside the firewall. We built a web on the whiteboard in Lena's office. Gravitas, Centrax Analytics, 3 other energy companies in the same region, 2 consulting firms sharing board members with Centrax, a lobbying group that had, only a year earlier, successfully pushed back on an EPA proposal to make raw sensor data mandatory in annual disclosures. It all pointed to the same strategy. Don't fight regulation, redefine compliance. And they'd been doing it for years. Meanwhile, Troy uncovered something else. A deleted Git repository archived through a crawler he had access to contained early versions of the Centrax firmware from 2013. In the changelog notes was an entry labeled V2.7, implemented soft silence mode for non-critical threshold deviations. I asked him what soft silence mode meant. He said, it makes the sensor record the value, but keeps it from triggering a flag. It shows up in raw logs, but not in any reporting layer unless you pull it manually. So unless you know exactly where to look, you'll never find it, he finished. And that's when I remembered something. 2 years earlier, when I was still in grad school, I'd met a woman at an environmental data conference, Dr. Eliza Marin, who had given a presentation about non-reportable anomalies in industrial waste readings. Her study had been quietly defunded before publication. At the time, I thought it was just bad politics. Now, I wondered if it was something else. I reached out. To my surprise, she replied. We met in a park outside Denver, her request. She looked older, more tired than I remembered. I told her what I'd found about Gravitas, about Centrax, about the soft silence mode. Her hands trembled. They tried to buy my data, she said quietly. When I refused, my lab lost funding. My institution told me it was a restructuring. It wasn't. She opened her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of her old sensor logs, ones she'd kept. Many showed spikes in chromium and nitrates in regions managed by companies using Centrax's system. And then she said, I thought I was the only one. Turns out I was just the first. That hit me hard, because I'd thought the same thing. On the drive back, I realized we had what most whistleblowers never get. A data trail, a legal framework, a timeline, a list of interconnected players. And now, multiple voices. Not just me, not just Ethan, not just Eliza. There was a pattern of scientists and analysts being pushed out, silenced, or restructured when they got too close. It had happened in Iowa, in Arizona, in Oregon. Gravitas wasn't the only fire. It was just the one I was standing in. We started to organize. Troy began building a secure database of logs and firmware versions across companies. Eliza agreed to come forward publicly under protection when the time came. Lena initiated contact with 2 investigative journalists and began drafting a whistleblower submission to the Senate Environmental Subcommittee. And I wrote everything down, not just the data, but the decisions, the moments of silence, the faces of people who'd warned me, pressured me, or simply vanished. I documented it all, because this wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was about the cost of burying the truth, and I was done letting them write the ending. You don't bring down a machine like this with a single button. You need pressure. You need timing, and most of all, you need visibility. That's what Lena said as we stood in front of her office whiteboard. Now completely covered in multicolored arrows, acronyms, file names, and names we had to blur out before taking any photos. She pointed to the top. Phase 1, leak strategy. Phase 2, legislative pressure. Phase 3, public reckoning. We were no longer gathering. We were preparing to launch. The first step was to package the evidence not as a conspiracy theory, but as a verifiable, reproducible, time-stamped dataset with Troy's help. We created mirror folders of all firmware iterations, changelogs, deleted logs restored via metadata, and annotated overlays that showed what the sensors actually read versus what was reported. Then we cross-referenced that data with EPA thresholds and community health statistics in counties affected by Gravitas and other Centrax clients. The results were horrifying. In 3 counties across 2 states, the spike in heavy metal levels correlated with statistically significant rises in cancer diagnoses. Especially in children. Eliza's old research helped validate the trend. Her work had been suppressed, now it was a foundation. Next, we reached out to 2 journalists. The first was Carla Wynn, a Pulitzer-nominated investigative reporter known for cracking open an oil company's shadow lobbying group 10 years ago. The second was Marcus Eldridge, a data transparency advocate who ran an independent news site with deep reach in policy circles. They didn't just agree to publish. They agreed to collaborate to split the story into 2 tracks. Carla would handle the human impact stories of silenced scientists, poisoned neighborhoods, vanished regulators. Marcus would break down the technical fraud firmware manipulation. Centrax's business model, lobbying influence. We timed the release to coincide with the National Environmental Oversight Conference, an annual industry event in D.C., where Gravitas's CEO, Ronald Huxley, was scheduled to give the keynote address titled Innovation and Integrity in Environmental Data. The irony was unbearable. Our plan: release the stories 36 hours before the speech. That would give media outlets time to run it wide, get reactions, and force reporters to confront Huxley during his quanda. Lena coordinated with 2 sympathetic congressional aides who promised to raise the issue on record in the Senate subcommittee the same week. Meanwhile, we initiated a federal whistleblower submission to the EPA Office of Inspector General, complete with signed affidavits from me, Eliza, a former Gravitas technician who had reprogrammed the sensors, a data analyst from a Centrax client who had seen similar suppression patterns. Lena also prepped an emergency injunction draft in case Gravitas tried to issue a gag order or legal threat after the story broke. We weren't just exposing them, we were cutting off every escape hatch. But we weren't naive. We knew there would be blowback. Carla warned me. The minute your name hits the article, you'll be a target. Troll farms, legal smear, discreditation campaigns. They'll dig into your school records if they have to. I know, I said. Let them look. I don't have anything to hide and they know it. Lena looked at me that night and asked, "Do you want to stay anonymous? There's still a version of this where you remain the source." I thought about it. About the voicemails, the reset passwords, the knock at my neighbor's door, the silent fear that had crept into every part of my life. And I said, "No, I want my name on it." Troy gave me a nod. Then we go full stack. In the final week before launch, we built a public-facing digital archive FairSoil.net where the full dataset would be available for public download once the stories dropped. Nothing sensitive, no names, just code comparisons, map overlays, and clear summaries of what had been hidden for so long. We added a quote to the homepage. This data belonged to the public. We're just giving it back. By the final night, everything was in place. Articles pre-scheduled, video segments edited, congressional letters queued, emergency legal packets printed. I didn't sleep. At 8:00 a.m. The next morning, the headlines hit. Sensor silence. How Centrax and Gravitas manipulated pollution data across America. The cost of clean reports. Cancer clusters and corporate code. Whistleblower exposes environmental suppression network with national reach. It was done. The match was lit. And the machine had no idea what was coming. The morning it dropped, the headlines didn't trickle out, they detonated. I sat in a borrowed apartment in D.C., staring at 3 open tabs as the story launched simultaneously across platforms. Carla's piece opened with a child's photo, Maya Jensen, age 9, leukemia diagnosis. Her family lived less than a mile from a Gravitas site in Missouri, where nitrate spikes had been suppressed for 7 consecutive quarters. Marcus's report dropped 10 minutes later, a brutal technical deep dive titled, "Environmental Fraud by Design, How Code Was Used to Rewrite Pollution Itself." Within 30 minutes, sensor silence was trending in 5 states. By noon, it was national. News anchors scrambled to summarize complex diagrams. EPA spokespeople gave carefully worded non-answers. Academics on Twitter started quote-threading everything, calling it the Volkswagen emissions scandal of environmental data. Gravitas issued its first statement at 12:43 p.m. "We take these allegations seriously and are committed to full cooperation with any regulatory review." It was the PR equivalent of a smoke alarm, loud, automatic, and hollow. But the fire had already spread. By 1:15 p.m., Senator Landon Hayes posted a tweet tagging the EPA, the Department of Justice, and Gravitas directly. Any company manipulating public health data doesn't deserve a seat at the table. They deserve a subpoena. At 3:07 p.m., the EPA's Inspector General released a public memo confirming receipt of a formal whistleblower submission, accompanied by technical documentation and sworn affidavits from multiple former employees. Meanwhile, Gravitas' stock, steady for years, plummeted 18% by market close. And the timing, perfect, because less than 24 hours later, Ronald Huxley, CEO of Gravitas, was set to deliver the keynote at the National Environmental Oversight Conference in front of lawmakers, investors, and industry executives. He walked on stage in a tailored charcoal suit and a face built for press releases. Cameras rolled. Reporters in the room had already seen the stories. The whispers were deafening. His speech began with forced confidence. "We at Gravitas believe in the power of transparency. Innovation must be built on trust." That's as far as he got before a reporter stood up mid-sentence. "Mr. Huxley, are you aware your company deployed sensors that masked lead and arsenic levels for over a decade?" Silence. Then a second voice. "Do you deny that firmware from Centrax Analytics, a Gravitas partner, was designed to suppress federal reporting triggers?" The room fractured. Some applauded. Some froze. The microphone cut. Huxley's eyes darted stage left, where a handler rushed forward. A moment later, the live feed dropped. By nightfall, Gravitas' board of directors had entered emergency session. A leaked internal email confirmed that legal counsel was actively assessing whistleblower exposure and federal risk. Outside corporate offices in 4 different states, protesters gathered. Some held signs with Maya's face. Others held printouts from our report. Some just held water bottles. Clear. clean, and full of lead. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Instead, I logged into the FairSoil net dashboard. We'd seen over 3 million unique visitors in a single day. Thousands had downloaded the full archive. Dozens of new tips had flooded the secure Dropbox from employees at other Centrax-partnered firms, from former regulators, even from a retired EPA technician who admitted the agency had suspicions, but never enough to act. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. A phone call from Gravitas. I recognized the number executive line. Corporate headquarters. I let it ring out. No voicemail, just pressure. Then Lena called. "They're trying to gauge how loud you're willing to get," she said. "You've already beaten their legal team to the story. Now they'll try to contain you personally. How? Buy you off, offer a position, wrap you into a settlement. And if I refuse, they'll escalate, discredit you, quietly. But the window is closing and they know it." That same night, we got word from Senator Hayes' office. The Senate Environmental Subcommittee was moving to issue a formal hearing request, and they wanted me to testify. On the record. As the whistleblower, not anonymous, not blurred. Full name, full voice. I stared at the email for a long time. I thought about the woman in the photo, Maya. I thought about Ethan, who'd tried to raise the alarm before disappearing from the system. I thought about Eliza, who nearly gave up. And I thought about the water, the soil, the data they thought no one would ever read. Then I wrote back, "I accept." By morning, the headlines had shifted again. Gravitas whistleblower to testify before Senate suppression case expands. My name was on the front page. I didn't feel exposed. I felt ready. The first to fall wasn't who we expected. It wasn't the CEO. Not yet. It was Dr. Alan Severin, Gravitas's former chief compliance officer, the man who'd quietly stepped down 2 years prior for personal reasons. We thought he'd disappeared into consulting. But now, he reappeared at a closed-door Senate session and, according to a source on the committee, provided testimony that validated every element of our report. He didn't try to play innocent. He brought copies of emails, risk memos, even a draft internal slide deck prepared in 2018 titled Sensor Optimization, Minimizing Noise, Maximizing Regulatory Confidence. His admission cracked the dam. Within 72 hours, a cascade began. 3 current executives at Gravitas were placed on administrative leave. Centrax Analytics removed all its online presence and went dark. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of families in 6 states citing exposure, negligence, and fraud. The Department of Justice confirmed it had opened a criminal inquiry into deliberate manipulation of federally mandated environmental data. And the moment everyone was waiting for came the following Monday. Ronald Huxley resigned. He didn't speak to press. No public appearance. Just a short statement released by Gravitas's legal team. Mr. Huxley has chosen to step down to ensure that the company can move forward transparently and free of distraction. Distraction. He'd spent a decade overseeing one of the most sophisticated systems of environmental deception in modern history, and now he walked away with a severance package most Americans would never see in 5 lifetimes. But it didn't matter, because the machine was no longer in his control. At the Senate hearing, I sat behind the microphone in a gray blazer, badge clipped to my lapel, cameras everywhere, my nameplate in front of me, a pitcher of water I didn't touch. The chairman addressed the room. "Ms. Reed, thank you for your courage. Your statement has not only sparked legislative review, it may have prevented decades of further harm." I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just spoke. I laid out the process. The firmware, the filters, the legal loopholes. I explained how data was buried not through ignorance, but design. I named the names that could be named. I gave the public what they had never been allowed to see. The truth, from someone who'd watched it being rewritten in real time. When the hearing adjourned, no one applauded, and that felt right. Because this wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. In the weeks that followed, policies began to shift. A bipartisan group of senators introduced the Transparent Environmental Data Act, requiring that raw, unfiltered sensor logs be submitted quarterly to the EPA with independent verification, and real criminal liability for falsification. Centrax's remaining leadership was subpoenaed. State environmental agencies reopened dozens of dormant complaints from the last 10 years. FairSoil, Net, our public archive, doubled in size as whistleblowers from other industries began submitting stories. But more than anything, I noticed the silence. No more login attempts, no more strange cars, no more vague emails from legal departments or veiled threats. Just silence. The kind that happens when a machine stops spinning because someone finally pulled the right gear. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't the end. But it was the first time in a very long time that I felt still, not because nothing was happening, but because something finally had, something irreversible. 2 weeks after the hearing, I received an invitation marked confidential from the Environmental Data Integrity Task Force, a new initiative formed under the joint directive of the EPA and the Senate subcommittee. I thought it was spam at first, but when Lena reviewed it, her face shifted. "This is real," she said. The letter, signed by a senior White House science advisor, formally invited me to serve as chief advisor for environmental transparency and data ethics, a newly created position that would act as an independent oversight liaison between public agencies, whistleblowers, and environmental data vendors. In short, they wanted me on the inside. The offer came with full authority to audit data systems, recommend policy reforms, and initiate investigations, plus a dedicated staff and budget. I'd have direct lines to both the EPA and congressional oversight committees. "They're offering you the firewall you never had," Lena said. I read the letter 3 times. Part of me wanted to say yes, immediately, not out of ego, but out of necessity. We'd cracked open one case, one company, but the methods Centrax developed were almost certainly being replicated elsewhere. If I accepted the role, I could investigate more, enforce, intervene before damage was done. But another part of me hesitated. Power, even with good intentions, comes at a cost. Bureaucracy wears down idealism. Inside the system, you can make rules, but you're also bound by them. There would be chains of command, pressure to compromise, politics disguised as strategy. And worst of all, I wouldn't be the outsider anymore. I'd be part of the machine I had just exposed. That night, I sat alone on the balcony of Lena's office, the city glowing below, the air thick with summer humidity. I looked down at the letter. It represented everything I thought I wanted: a seat at the table, a voice that couldn't be ignored. But then I thought of Fair Soil, of the hundreds of whistleblower reports we'd received in the past month, of the trust that came not from authority, but from independence, from not wearing anyone's badge. In the morning, I sent my reply, with gratitude and respect. I must decline. Some systems can only be watched, not joined. Lena said nothing, just smiled and nodded once. The world wanted me to step into a tower. I chose to build a lighthouse instead. For the first time in months, I had space to think. No emails, no encrypted messages, no backdoor leaks or midnight meetings, just quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't follow panic, but purpose. I went home, not just physically. I went back to the apartment I hadn't set foot in since the day my badge stopped working. The dishes were still in the sink. My notebooks. My books? The coffee mug Ethan gave me after our first site audit, all untouched. It was like walking into a version of myself that hadn't yet seen what I now knew. I stood in the center of the room and asked a question I hadn't dared ask before. What now? It would have been easy to fade back, let the system course correct now that the worst had surfaced. Let new laws pass. Let the task forces form, let others fight. But that felt incomplete, because the fight wasn't about one company or one policy. It was about the idea that truth only matters when it's convenient, that numbers can be bent until they break people. And I couldn't be okay with that. So I began sketching something new, a platform that wasn't just an archive like Fair Soil, but an infrastructure, a place where scientists, engineers, and whistleblowers could upload raw data anonymously, with automatic third-party verification. No middlemen, no lobbying pressure, just facts, protected and permanent. Lena helped me file for nonprofit status. Troy offered to build the encryption protocol himself. We called it the Unfiltered Project. One of the volunteers, a former EPA intern, asked me if I ever regretted not taking the government role. I told her the truth. If I join the system, I might make it safer. But if I stand outside it, I might make it honest. That was the choice. Not escape or surrender, but alignment. Because after everything they erased, everything they buried, everything they tried to hide, all I wanted was to create a space where the truth didn't have to claw its way to the surface. It could just exist, out in the open, where it belonged. A year later, I stood on a stage in Portland, Oregon, not in front of a Senate committee or a press conference, but at a community hall filled with students, environmental advocates, retired engineers, and a few people who'd driven 4 hours just to say thank you. The sign behind me didn't say whistleblower. It said Citizen Scientist Gathering, data for the public good. Funny how something so simple could feel more powerful than any government title. I didn't speak as a symbol. I spoke as myself, Natalie Reed, a woman who once scanned groundwater readings in a cornfield and thought she was just doing her job. I told them what happened, what they already knew in headlines but needed to hear in full sentences, how a system was built to make silence look like truth, and how the people inside that system weren't villains in dark rooms, just professionals taught to stop asking questions. I didn't end with a call to arms. I ended with a story about Maya Jensen, the girl in the photo. Her mother sent me an update 6 months ago. Maya's in remission. She's walking again. Her favorite class is science. They asked her once what she wanted to be when she grows up. She said, "I want to measure water." For real. That's what this was always about. Not revenge, not headlines, not even justice, at least not in the courtroom sense. It was about making sure that the next generation didn't have to wonder if their drinking water came with a hidden disclaimer. That truth wasn't a luxury filtered through politics, but something inherent, accessible, protected. After the applause faded and the crowd began to leave, a man approached me, late 40s, quiet. He didn't introduce himself. He just said, "I used to work in data analytics. We saw things. We just didn't know how to speak." I handed him a card, not with my name, just a link. The unfiltered. Org. He looked at it like it weighed more than paper. Then he nodded and walked away. And I realized something. I didn't blow the system up. I didn't burn it down. I just put a light in the hallway so the next person wouldn't have to walk through it blind.